Hello, my name is Al Clark and welcome to the Blackboard Sessions. This session is called Digital Audio for Skeptics. And today we're going to talk about digital audio for those who maybe think there's something that's not quite legitimate about digital audio today. I know there's not a lot of you left, but we're going to speak to this regardless. What I'm not going to do today is I'm not going to talk about who makes the best A to D or who makes the best DACs, any of this sort of thing. I'm going to take you a little bit on a thought experiment. And I want to bear with me on what we're going to do, and then I'll try to put context around all this. So I think we could all agree that everything in the world starts with an analog signal. So I'm going to treat this first as if it was an A to D converter, in other words, analog to digital conversion. But understand, everything I talk about from that perspective really is exactly the same when we do the inverse, the digital audio conversion. It just may be a little easier to conceptualize using just one-sided versus the other. But fundamentally, it's really the same. So this is a symbol for a microphone, in case you were wondering. And we're going to, since it's a thought experiment, somewhere out in nature here, we have something that makes sound. So some event here makes sound. And we're going to put it into some kind of a microphone and amplifier. And because this is a thought experiment, this is perfect. Because we're not trying to deal with anything that doesn't start out initially as perfect for our exercise. And the reason I'm drawing it this way is this is going to be our starting point. So let's say that we have some kind of a thing out here, and I'm going to just treat it like a sine wave, only because it's easy to draw and point to things, not because most of us in our record collection or our digital audio collection or whatever we're listening to are probably not listening to 440 tones and the like as our preferred music genre. But let's assume that we've recorded something and we can represent it as a simple sine wave. And of course it continues and so forth. And we're going to call that sine wave for the moment our point of reference, our beginning spot. That's perfect. So that's our first assumption for our little thought experiment. So the first thing I want to say is that in an analog system, this wave is continuous. It means that it starts at DC, it goes to end of light, a little higher than that, in fact, and it just continues and so forth. And so it seems very seductive. That's kind of our ideal. And it is. So the first thing we do in a digital system is we do something called sampling. And we basically look at something every so often. And I'm going to just pick some points here. And most of the time these are evenly spaced, and that's what I'm drawing here. And we pick this little spot. And so we have a time here between samples. Each of these are samples. This might be 1, 2, 3, whatever. And we can pick them with a certain amount of accuracy. And for the most part, so we have a number here, and we have this little thing here, and that's called our quantization. How accurate is that measurement? And so you can say, oh, well, gee, this isn't all that special because the perfect thing's in between. And maybe I can't measure it perfectly in that line. Maybe I'm a little high or a little low each time. And I'm not looking at it all the time. So let's live with that for a moment and let's say that I was sampling more often. Here and here and here and so forth. And let's say that error point is smaller and smaller. So if I'm going to draw a really big one here. Let's say I'm sampling right here and I barely have any variation from best to worst. And let's say the next one is really close and so forth. So what happens if I conceptually sample at, I don't know, 1 trillion times a second? 1 trillion times a second, I'm going to look at this little wave. And let's say I could measure it with, thousands of bits. In other words, thousands of precision. Well, at some point, it's going to merge right precisely to that line. Right? So, and I think at some point, I think we'd all agree that it would be indistinguishable from the analog signal, no matter how we looked at it. So we don't actually do that, but if you were willing to accept that if I could sample fast enough and precise enough that it'd be indistinguishable from analog from any point of view, now we're only talking about how good does it have to be. Because we've established a boundary. We've said, okay, conceptually digital audio is okay, given that we can sample often enough and with enough precision. And that's the first, if you won't accept that, I probably can't win you over at all. But I'm assuming that you're a reasonable person and perhaps you might give me that argument. So, what does this really mean? Well, in today's world, that there's a couple rules. How often we look at that wave matters. And in digital audio today, it's typically, for music, it typically starts at about 44.1 kilohertz, what you'd have in a CD, and it goes up to nominally 96, 192, 384, and so forth. And there's reasons why, once we get sufficiently fast, that we don't really have any more meaningful information that we care about at some point. So rather than say, well, how fast is important, let's just assume that in today's world we can sample at 96 or 192 or perhaps 384, and that's probably very, very sufficient to do a good job for a signal that's good, say, to 20 kilohertz. 20 kilohertz is a reasonable boundary. I know there are people who think there may be important things above 20 kilohertz. That may be true, but it's certainly true that everything below 20 kilohertz we all care about. No, there's no controversy about that. So I'm going to suggest that we can measure this often enough. In a typical high-end digital audio system, that's probably 192 kilohertz, which is pretty good. And how close are we talking about now? Well, in a typical A to D converter that falls into maybe a state-of-the-art consideration, the dynamic range might be north of 120 dB, and we'll talk about that number in a moment and how that reflects to everything else. So let's backtrack, because so far you're saying, okay, that's all fine, Al, but you know, that's still not as good as analog, because hey, analog doesn't have any of those things. It's perfect, right? Well, kind of, except there's a catch. So in today's audio world, most analog today that's pure analog, or what we might think of as pure analog, is probably a vinyl record. And why is that important? Well, because a vinyl record doesn't have a tremendously large dynamic range. So there's a guy did a paper, his name is Jim, I hope he got his last name right, Lesurf. We'll send you a link, we'll show you a link for him. He wrote a paper called Digital Vinyl. And it's very interesting because what he calculates is the fact that you've got finite size of molecules in vinyl, and that the theoretical best signal to noise of vinyl might be 70 dB. I know empirically, looking at a lot of vinyl over a lot of years, that a 70 dB range on a piece of vinyl recording is better than any vinyl I ever had. So I'm going to tell you that it's maybe 60 dB. And if you want to say, well, that's not fair, maybe it could be higher, well, then I'll say that an A to D converter might be better than 120. And if you want to say, well, it's 65, I'll say, well, an A to D can be 125, and we can play this game all we want. But the practical reality is that this perfect signal, remember we start off with our perfect signal down here because it's conceptual. In real life, that perfect signal has noise riding over it, exaggerated in my pen, like that. So at any one point we look at this, it's not the perfect spot in the middle, it's the peak or the valley of the noise at that point. Now, how much is that versus, say, 120 dB? Well, if you know anything about how the math works, 120 dB is 1,000 times more accurate than 60. 60 dB is 1,000. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I can't measure this perfectly at a little spot, but I can measure it 1,000 times better than the noise that, say, a typical vinyl LP would have. So I'm not really comparing perfect analog to perfect digital. I'm comparing real analog to real digital. And in a signal, from a dynamic range point of view, it's about 1,000 times. Now, what does that really mean? What's 120 dB mean? Imagine we were measuring distance. And we'll pick some nice numbers again because these are nice magic numbers. 120 dB is a million. Okay? So, let's say we're measuring something. I say, how far is it to, I don't know, the corner or down the street to the neighbor's house? And you say, well, it's a kilometer. Well, with this resolution, I say a kilometer, that's kind of a rough number. I mean, how do I say, well, okay, it's a kilometer within 1 millimeter accuracy. That's what 120 dB is. So it's not a kilometer, maybe it's 1.0000 blah, blah, blah resolution. Well, that's not too bad for accuracy. Try doing that with your tape measure or even a laser measurement. Now at 60, it's a kilometer plus or minus a meter. Now that may still be good enough, but it's a meter is a whole lot different than a millimeter. So really that's kind of the extent of this conversation. But I wanted to bring up one more little thing, and that is that you actually already are probably listening to digital audio all the time. And I don't mean the stuff that you stream from a music streaming service or what you might have on a CD. I'm talking about the vinyl in your collection. Because in fact, unless you buy all your vinyl from estate sales and garage sales that were made a long time ago, they probably are all stored in digital format, and then when they cut the actual LP, they're translating it back to analog. So it was already digital in the first place. So that's really the only thing I wanted to talk about in this particular session. The next session that we talk about, we may talk more about some of the issues of oversampling and upsampling and how that has context within today's world. Thank you.